Hey, Randy Joe here, and this is 1000 Reviews, the series where I plan on reviewing every single album from the 1000 Albums Listened to Before You Die book. And today we're looking at Lupe Fiasco's 2006 debut album, Food and Liquor. Food and Liquor was released underneath the Atlantic label, produced by various producers, art direction, no pattern, nationality, USA, in a running time of 72 minutes and 16 seconds. Now, Lupe Fiasco is a pretty underrated artist, I would say, from the late 2000s, who never managed to really reach the heights of this debut here, Food and Liquor, despite that he is quite the influential artist at the time, by showcasing his lyrical abilities and his very conscious rap during a time that was very focused on bling and sex and money. Lupe Fiasco stood out in the rap crowd in the same way someone like Kanye West did, especially since this album seems to take quite a bit of influence from Mr. West, especially with his last album before this one, Late Registration, which came out in 2005. And I think you could see a lot of the parallels between Late Registration and Food and Liquor, although I would argue that Food and Liquor does the lyrical content much better than Late Registration does, despite the fact that I would say that the overall sound and aesthetic of Late Registration is much more thorough and much better produced than Food and Liquor. But this isn't a Late Registration review, this is a Food and Liquor review, and that being said, this thing is still quite amazing all on its own without any comparisons. The intro to this thing, entitled Intro, is just that, with Lupe Fiasco's sister Aisha coming onto the track and giving out this poetic performance, sort of like a slam poetry style performance that will showcase what the album will be about how all these things that are cool are ultimately self-sabotaging and destructive. And she does this performance just before Lupe Fiasco comes in, introduces himself, labels himself as a Muslim, makes a point of that, and addresses the fact that the album will be about the various things that his sister has since mentioned, quite literally being an introduction to this thing. Songwriting seems to be the greatest strength of this album and really is the highlight for Lupe Fiasco, and that's quite obvious with the second track, Real, where he sets up this structure of a hook, kind of proposing a question of sorts or a scenario of sorts, and then the verse providing the answers to these scenarios, which is a pretty interesting dynamic to create in the hook verse hook, and ultimately kind of shows off the interesting structure and songwriting abilities of Lupe Fiasco. And since I'm discussing songwriting, I might as well jump into some of the best written songs on here, Kick Push and Kick Push 2, both of which use a skateboarding metaphor and the love and hobby of skateboarding to demonstrate a metaphor for life. And not just life, but as a hobby for escapism and a way to escape the world's issues and the world's problems and to keep pushing forward, to keep kick push, like the title suggests. As this hobby progresses through the song and further develops, Lupe Fiasco discusses his life flourishing as he discovers these new like-minded people and continues to push forward through his life struggles or have his entire life develop around him, while this hobby is what he uses as a way to escape from the harshness of reality. And I think another thing about Kick Push, both of these tracks, is that the orchestration elements are definitely, I think, influenced by Late Registration, as that is a heavy use of orchestration on that album, and the same style and tone definitely carries into Kick Push. Continuing on this songwriting bout, there's also the instrumental, which is one of my favorite ones on here, as Lupe Fiasco discusses the trials and tribulations of screen addiction and overall media addiction, and our overall addictions to TVs and phones. I think at the time this track came out and seemed as if it focused purely on entertainment and TV, but now in the year 2021, this feels like it is still just as not, if not more relevant than ever, as people are having a bad case of phone addiction, something that I think most people I know would admit to. Social media especially being a large play into this. So with the instrumental, he discusses people's need to feel included online and their overall loss of individuality by delving deep into the psychology of screen addiction and the fear of missing out. Lupe Fiasco uses his same verse 2 times over before diving back into this box metaphor, this box being the TV, and about how this box will ultimately box himself in if he gives into his addiction. Fear of looking away just for a second over the fact that he might miss out on the next big thing. This track especially, I think, is by far the most timeless of all the tracks on this album, and arguably the most important statement on Food and Liquor, while at the same time being absolutely catchy and well produced on top of that to make this thing just as poppy as it is important and influential, as well as foreshadowing. And honestly, Lupe Fiasco just does such a great job when it comes to just telling stories. You have the track Daydreamin, which has a fantastic sample throughout, which is used just geniusly, in my opinion, as he uses this building metaphor and the buildings in his city coming together as a robot as a way to describe the metaphors of hip-hop culture and its issues. Allegedly, this entire story came from Lupe Fiasco's father, who told him that if you put all the buildings in Chicago together, they would eventually form a giant robot. And this very idea is used in this track to create these parallels. The Cool is another track that Lupe Fiasco adds onto here, which would later be referenced again on his second album, entitled The Cool, where this time is about a gangster or hustler of some sort who comes back to life and digs himself out of his own grave before trying to free himself from the previous life he had, having a new second chance at this thing, while ultimately in the end falling right back into the same loopholes and the same traps that were in his previous life and falling back into the same rhythm of a gangster hustler, kind of showing that no matter what you do, you will always fall back into the same lifestyle as much as you try to escape it. And lastly, I want to talk about American Terrorist, where Lupe Fiasco again is flexing his songwriting abilities to go over the American history of racial bigotry throughout their history, and really just highlights all the issues with America in many, many ways, while at the same time maintaining a very up-tempo and upbeat and enjoyable, catchy track. It really dives into the fact that the white males of America are the terrorists in a way and are using different minorities to basically get what they want. Really diving into each facet imaginable. And even though I do think that most of this album production-wise does feel a little bit dated, feeling very reminiscent of the late 2000s style that isn't that around anymore, there are definitely some great songs on here production-wise that still stand out today. For example, the song I Gotcha, which is produced by the Neptunes, has just this amazing and instantly catchy, recognizable beat that feels very reminiscent of what the Neptunes were doing with the Clips album Lord Willin'. And with this song, Lupe Fiasco is also discussing the fact that he is here to save hip-hop in a way, which now seems like every single artist and their mother has said at this point and never seems to really live up to most of the time. But this time, Lupe Fiasco is doing it with a reason, as his entire album, Food and Liquor here, was leaked prior to its release, with this track as well as a handful of others not being included. And Lupe Fiasco went and recorded this track as well as the others after his leaks received widespread critical acclaim. And in here, he is just quite literally addressing the acclaim he's gotten so far and saying, yes, thanks for acknowledging my existence, thanks for acknowledging my impact, and I'm here to save the community. So it's not like what he is saying throughout I Gotcha is without merit or is being said just to toot his own horn, like many artists seem to. There is definitely a reason as to why he feels as if he is being put into a position here, considering all the significant praise he was getting long before the official release of his debut. There are a few songs on here that I do find to be quite weak. Sunshine, for example, just feels kind of bland and generic and quite dated when compared to everything else on this album. First Date metaphor being quite straightforward and literal, and with only a slight metaphor for his upcoming hip-hop career. And even that isn't interesting enough to merit an entire song that production-wise doesn't stand out like some of the other tracks might. Or even Pressure, which again is another track that I don't find that engaging and I find seems to slip through the cracks of the fantastic tracks that encompass most of this album. At 16 tracks long, this album does have a few filler tracks in between the great ones. But then this album closes out with Outro, which is just a pretty standard outro track. It is literally him for 12 minutes thanking people and naming his influences throughout, so I don't feel fair in including this as part of a review, as this is quite literally a credits, sort of like a credits rolling at the end of the movie. He just lists literally everyone who had a part in making this album. And I welcome it, because I think it is just an overall very wholesome way to close out the album. So with that all being said, this is a pretty great album throughout. I do think it is quite influential, and I do believe it still flies under the radar to this day. I feel like it has slipped through the cracks for a lot of hip-hop fans. So with the soft rating coming to an 8.1, I will harden that down to an 8 out of 10, and I give this a grade of E for essential. So this is definitely worth a listen, especially if you're a hip-hop fan. I do think there is quite a bit on the songwriting level that is worthy to hear here. All right, the next album we are listening to is 1 to 1001 Generate 620, which will be the album. 620 being the Go-Betweens 16 Lovers Lane. I will review that in about 1 week from now. All right, that pretty much does it for this video. If you like this video, please hit like and subscribe if you want to follow along and listen to every album from the 1001 Albums to Listen to Before You Die book. And as always, my name is Randy Joe, and I am signing off.